For more than 3 decades, one man has been able to make billions of people laugh without saying very much at all. A strange expression, an awkward stare, a tiny shrug, a ridiculous little dance. And somehow the entire world knew exactly what Mr. Bean was thinking. He could walk into a hotel, a restaurant, a church, a department store, or even an ordinary living room and turn the simplest situation into complete chaos. But behind that unforgettable face was a very different man. His name is Rowan Atkinson. To millions of people, Rowan Atkinson is almost impossible to separate from the character he created. Say the name Mr. Bean, and most people immediately picture the same brown jacket, red tie, tiny car, and teddy bear. But Rowan Atkinson has spent much of his life trying to explain that Mr. Bean is not simply an extension of his own personality. In fact, some of his most revealing comments suggest almost the opposite. The character that made him one of the most recognizable comedians in the world has also been one of the most demanding roles of his career. And when Atkinson spoke openly about the pressure of playing Mr. Bean, he confirmed something many fans had quietly suspected for years. The man behind the character does not necessarily experience Mr. Bean the way the audience does. For audiences, Mr. Bean means laughter. For Atkinson, the character can mean responsibility, pressure, repetition, physical exhaustion, and the enormous expectation of making millions of people laugh. That revelation becomes even more fascinating when you understand where Rowan Atkinson came from. Because before he became Mr. Bean, before the television shows, before the movies, before the international fame, before children around the world recognized his face, Rowan Atkinson was a quiet young man who struggled with something that made ordinary communication extremely difficult. And that struggle would eventually become one of the most important clues to understanding the performer behind Mr. Bean. Rowan Sebastian Atkinson was born on January 6, 1955, in England. He studied electrical and electronic engineering at Newcastle University before continuing his education at Oxford University, where he completed a master's degree in electrical engineering. Nothing about that path suggested that he was destined to become one of the world's most famous comedians. Engineering appeared to be his future. Comedy was something else, something unexpected, something that emerged when he was performing. At Oxford, Atkinson began developing a style that depended heavily on physical expression, timing, facial movement, and visual comedy. He discovered that he could communicate enormous amounts of information without relying on long speeches. That idea would eventually become the foundation of Mr. Bean. But the character didn't appear overnight. Long before Mr. Bean had a name, Atkinson was experimenting with a strange, almost silent comic personality. His work with writer Richard Curtis helped develop the idea of a man who could create enormous problems while remaining almost completely unaware of how ridiculous he appeared to everyone around him. The concept was simple, but the execution was incredibly difficult. Because when a comedian speaks, words can carry the joke. Mr. Bean barely needed words. His face had to do the work. His eyes had to do the work. His body had to do the work. His pauses had to do the work. Even silence had to become funny. That required extraordinary control. Before Mr. Bean, however, Atkinson had already established himself through other forms of comedy. He became part of the groundbreaking British sketch series Not the 9 O'Clock News, working alongside performers including Mel Smith, Griff Rhys-Jones, and Pamela Stephenson. Then came Blackadder. And this is an important part of the story because people sometimes forget just how different Rowan Atkinson could be. Mr. Bean is almost silent. Blackadder was the opposite. It was fast, verbal, sarcastic, intelligent, and packed with complicated dialogue. Atkinson played Edmund Blackadder across different historical periods, and the series became one of the defining British comedies of its era. In other words, Rowan Atkinson was never simply the Mr. Bean guy. He was a highly versatile comedian who could move from physical comedy to sophisticated verbal satire. But eventually, another character began to take over his public identity, Mr. Bean. When the original television series premiered in 1990, audiences immediately understood that they were watching something different. The character didn't behave like a normal adult. He approached everyday life with the logic of a child. A simple trip could become a disaster. A normal task could become an impossible challenge. A minor inconvenience could become a full-scale battle. And the most important part was that Mr. Bean rarely understood that he was the problem. That was precisely why audiences found him so funny. Atkinson himself later explained the fundamental appeal of the character. Watching an adult behave childishly without realizing how inappropriate his behavior can be is inherently comic. He also understood that because the humor was visual rather than heavily dependent on language, it could travel across borders much more easily. And that turned out to be incredibly important. Mr. Bean didn't need to be translated. A facial expression works in Britain. It works in America. It works in India. It works in Pakistan. It works in Africa. It works in Europe. It works almost anywhere. That universal quality helped turn a British television character into an international phenomenon. The original live-action series ran for only 15 episodes. Yet those episodes became extraordinarily valuable. The character moved into films, books, animation, merchandise, television reruns, and digital media. The franchise continued to grow long after the original live-action series ended. And that is where the story becomes complicated. Because when a character becomes this successful, the audience begins to believe that the actor must love playing him. After all, why wouldn't he? Imagine creating a character that becomes globally famous. Imagine millions of people waiting to see you. Imagine children recognizing you everywhere. Imagine your creation becoming a cultural icon. From the outside, it looks like a dream. But acting is not the same thing as watching. The audience sees the finished joke. The actor experiences the process. And Rowan Atkinson eventually became remarkably honest about that process. In a 2021 interview, Atkinson said that he did not particularly enjoy playing Mr. Bean. He described the responsibility as unpleasant and said that performing the character was stressful and exhausting. That statement changed the way many people looked at the character. Think about what that means. The world watches Mr. Bean and laughs. Atkinson watches the production schedule and sees work. The audience sees a hilarious physical sequence. Atkinson may see repeated takes. The audience sees a ridiculous facial expression lasting 2 seconds. Atkinson may have spent hours preparing, rehearsing, repeating, and physically performing it. The audience sees effortless comedy. The performer experiences the effort behind it. And this is perhaps the biggest misunderstanding surrounding Mr. Bean. The character looks effortless because Rowan Atkinson made it look effortless. That is not the same thing as being effortless. In fact, physical comedy can be brutally demanding. Every movement has to be precise. Every reaction has to arrive at exactly the right moment. If a facial expression lasts too long, the joke can disappear. If it ends too quickly, the audience may miss it. If the body movement is slightly wrong, the entire sequence can fail. And unlike dialogue, where a performer can sometimes recover from a mistake with improvisation, physical comedy often depends on timing down to tiny movements. Atkinson has spoken about how difficult some of these performances were. In discussing his work, he has recalled how physically exhausting certain Mr. Bean sequences could become. British GQ, for example, documented his comments about filming Mr. Bean's holiday, including a sequence involving cyclists that required tremendous physical effort. That gives us a completely different image of Mr. Bean. We see a man riding around France and causing chaos. Behind the camera, Atkinson is working, again, and again, and again, until the scene works. There is another fascinating part of this story. Mr. Bean was never designed to depend heavily on language. That meant Atkinson had to become extraordinarily expressive. His eyes became punctuation. His eyebrows became dialogue. His mouth became a reaction. His hands became sentences. His entire body became a language. This is why Mr. Bean could become famous in countries where audiences did not speak English. The character communicated through behavior, and that was one of the greatest creative decisions Atkinson ever made. But it also created a burden. Because once audiences became accustomed to Mr. Bean, they expected perfection. They didn't simply want Rowan Atkinson. They wanted Mr. Bean. Every time. That is the strange trap of creating an iconic character. The character becomes bigger than the person who created it. Atkinson could walk into a room as Rowan. The audience could still see Bean. He could appear in an interview. People would ask about Bean. He could promote another film. People would ask about Bean. He could age. Mr. Bean remained frozen in the public imagination. The character was permanently associated with a younger-looking version of Atkinson. And that may explain why the actor gradually became more cautious about physically returning to the role. In 2018, When Atkinson appeared on the Graham Norton show, he was asked about the possibility of Mr. Bean returning. His answer was remarkably direct. He said he doubted that the character would reappear, while adding that one should never say never. Reports from the interview emphasized that Atkinson felt there came a point when you had done what you could with a character. That was not the statement fans wanted. Fans wanted another episode, another movie, another ridiculous adventure, another encounter with Teddy, another disaster involving the little Minnie. But Atkinson was looking at the situation differently. He wasn't asking, do people still want Mr. Bean? He knew they did. The real question was, do I want to keep doing this? And those are two completely different questions. The answer became even clearer in later interviews. Atkinson explained that the weight of responsibility associated with Mr. Bean was not pleasant for him. He found the role stressful. He found it exhausting. And he looked forward to the end of performing it. That doesn't mean he hates the character. That distinction is important. It is entirely possible to be proud of something while no longer wanting to perform it in the same way. An athlete can love the sport but retire. A musician can love an album but never want to perform the songs again. A writer can love a novel but never want to revisit the characters. And an actor can love a character while recognizing that playing that character physically has become too demanding. In fact, Atkinson's relationship with Mr. Bean appears to be exactly that kind of complicated relationship. The character changed his life, but the character also demanded a lot from him. And the older he became, the more obvious that physical cost became. By the time Atkinson reached his 60s and then 70s, the question of whether he would return as the live-action Mr. Bean became increasingly interesting. Yet he found another way to keep the character alive. Animation. That was a brilliant solution. In animated form, Mr. Bean could continue having adventures without requiring Atkinson to physically perform every movement on camera. And Atkinson could still contribute his voice and creative understanding of the character. Banijay announced in 2024 that Mr. Bean, the animated series, had been commissioned for a fourth run, with Atkinson executive producing and voicing the character. The announcement described the new run as 52 additional episodes and noted that the animated franchise had reached 182 episodes across its runs. That detail is important because it proves something. Mr. Bean wasn't disappearing. He was evolving. The character could continue even if the original actor no longer wanted to put his body through the same physical demands. And perhaps that is what Atkinson's comments were really telling fans. Mr. Bean doesn't necessarily need Rowan Atkinson to physically become Mr. Bean every time. The character has become a franchise. But Rowan Atkinson remains the person who understands the character better than anyone else. There is something almost poetic about that. A character born from silence became one of the world's loudest comedy brands. A man who once struggled with communication created a character who barely speaks. A performer trained in engineering created comedy based on precision. And an actor who has spent decades being recognized for one character has repeatedly reminded audiences that there is much more to him than Mr. Bean. The irony is enormous. Mr. Bean is chaotic. Rowan Atkinson is known for precision. Mr. Bean makes decisions without thinking. Atkinson's comedy is carefully constructed. Mr. Bean is childish. Atkinson's career was built on intelligence, writing, timing, and technical control. Mr. Bean hates complicated situations. Atkinson's best comedy often comes from extremely complicated construction. The character and the man could hardly be more different. And perhaps that's why the character works. Another major clue came from Atkinson's discussion of his other work. When asked about his career, he has indicated that he doesn't particularly enjoy the process of making things and has described Blackadder as an exception because the responsibility for making the show funny was shared among many people. That statement tells us something important about Atkinson's creative personality. He appears to be deeply aware of responsibility. He doesn't simply walk onto a set and hope something funny happens. He worries about whether it works, whether the audience will laugh, whether the timing is correct, whether the character is right, whether the scene delivers. That kind of perfectionism can be a gift. It can also become exhausting. And Mr. Bean placed an enormous amount of that responsibility on Atkinson himself. Because Bean didn't have long conversations with other characters. He didn't deliver complicated speeches. He couldn't rely on witty dialogue to rescue a weak scene. The joke often had to live inside Atkinson's performance. His face, his timing, his physical reactions. That meant the pressure was concentrated. And the more successful Mr. Bean became, the greater that pressure became. Imagine knowing that billions of people have expectations about one facial expression. Imagine knowing that a character you created is now recognized almost everywhere. Imagine being asked to reproduce the same magic decades after you first created it. That is not necessarily freedom. Sometimes fame creates a prison. The very thing that makes audiences love you can become the thing you feel most trapped by. And this may be the hidden truth behind the phrase, Mr. Bean finally confirms what we all suspected. The suspicion isn't that Rowan Atkinson secretly became Mr. Bean in real life. It isn't that every strange thing Bean does represents Atkinson's personality. It isn't that the character is literally a secret version of himself. The more interesting truth is simpler. The man who gave the world Mr. Bean has never experienced the character in the same carefree way the audience does. For viewers, Bean is entertainment. For Atkinson, Bean is also responsibility. And once you understand that, some of the character's history looks different. Take the famous 2012 London Olympics appearance. Mr. Bean appeared during the opening ceremony, giving audiences another unforgettable performance. It was the kind of moment that seemed to prove the character was immortal. Even after the original live-action series had ended years earlier, Mr. Bean could still walk onto the world's biggest stage and immediately make millions of people laugh. But that kind of performance also required physical commitment. The audience saw the joke. The performer felt the work. And as Atkinson grew older, the physical demands of slapstick naturally became more significant. This is one reason his move toward animation makes so much sense. Voice performance allows him to contribute to the character without requiring the same level of physical strain. Banijay itself quoted Atkinson saying that he has enjoyed the animated version of Mr. Bean and appreciates the freedoms available in animated form. That may be one of the most revealing clues of all. He didn't say the character had to disappear. Instead, he found a different way to keep the character alive. The world still gets Mr. Bean. Rowan gets a version of Mr. Bean that is less physically demanding. Everyone wins. There is another reason the character remains so powerful. Mr. Bean does not belong entirely to one generation. Parents watched him. Their children watched him. Then those children grew up and introduced him to their own children. The character survives because his comedy is not tied to one political moment, one celebrity feud, one complicated cultural reference, or one specific language. A man tries to park. He fails. A man goes shopping. Something goes wrong. A man tries to eat. Disaster follows. A man goes on holiday. Chaos appears. These situations are universal. And because the character behaves like an exaggerated child trapped inside an adult body, audiences immediately understand him. You don't need a dictionary to understand Mr. Bean. You only need to watch him. That is an extraordinary achievement. Very few characters have crossed cultural boundaries so successfully. And while the animated franchise continues to expand, Atkinson himself has continued exploring other characters and projects. One of the most notable later examples was Man vs. Bee, in which he returned to physical comedy in a different role. Instead of being Mr. Bean, he played Trevor Bingley, a house sitter whose attempts to deal with a bee spiral into increasingly ridiculous situations. The premise was almost a reminder of Atkinson's greatest strength. He could create physical comedy without simply repeating Mr. Bean. He could build a new character around the same basic principles of timing, frustration, escalation, and visual humor. That distinction matters. Because Rowan Atkinson is not Mr. Bean. He is the performer who created Mr. Bean. And after decades of fame, that difference becomes increasingly important. At 70, audiences were not simply looking at an aging Mr. Bean. They were looking at Rowan Atkinson, a veteran performer who had already accomplished what most comedians could only dream of. He had created multiple iconic characters. He had starred in major television series. He had appeared in internationally successful films. He had built a career spanning decades. He had taken a character with almost no dialogue and turned him into a global brand. And perhaps now he had earned the right to decide how much of that character he wanted to carry. There is something else worth remembering. Mr. Bean was never supposed to be a superhero. He doesn't save the world. He doesn't solve major crimes. He doesn't have special powers. He is an ordinary man who makes ordinary situations extraordinary through his own inability to behave normally. That simplicity is exactly why the character became so powerful. But simplicity is deceptive. Making something look simple can require enormous skill. A great magician makes a difficult trick look easy. A great dancer makes difficult movement look effortless. A great comedian can make carefully constructed timing appear spontaneous. Rowan Atkinson did exactly that. And perhaps that is why the public misunderstood his relationship with the character for so long. We saw the laughter. We didn't see the exhaustion. We saw the finished episode.